And we're now on to paper 2 content. This is C8, rates and equilibrium. What is rate? Well, the rate of a reaction is how fast the reactants turn to the products. So we can use the reaction rate equals the amount of products made or reactant used up divided by time. And there are several different experiments that we can use to calculate rate. So the first one is using cotton wool inside a conical flask on some scales, and inside the conical flask is marble chips and hydrochloric acid. Now marble chips is made up of calcium carbonate, CaCO3, and you need to be able to recall the products of this reaction, which will be calcium chloride, carbon dioxide and water. Now because carbon dioxide is a gas, that gas is allowed to escape, so we can measure a decrease in mass. All the cotton wool does is prevent any liquid spilling. Now our results can be hooked up to a data logger to measure continuous data, and when we plot a graph, rate will be the gradient of that graph. We can also use a gas syringe or a water trough with an upturned measuring cylinder to measure the volume of gas produced, so the volume of the product produced, and again the gradient will equal the rate of reaction. And our last experiment is using a conical flask with a cross. So instead of marble chips, this time we use sodium thiosulfate and hydrochloric acid, and we measure the time for the clarity to change, and this time rate will equal 1 over the time taken. And if we want to increase our accuracy in this experiment, we can use a light sensor. Now, rate is really important in chemical industry, and this is because if we can find a way to increase the rate, we can potentially increase profits, but we do need to look at safety considerations. Now we look at the collision theory, and this is the theory that a reaction will only take place if the collisions between the reactants are successful, and to be successful they need to be colliding with a kinetic energy that is greater than the activation energy. And there are different factors that can increase the rate of a reaction. So the first one we're going to look at is concentration. Now the experiment for this is to add 25 centimetres cubed of hydrochloric acid with 1 gram of marble chips, so calcium carbonate. We then collect the gas, measuring and recording the volume every 30 seconds, and repeat with a different concentration of acid. Now as we're increasing the dissolved reactant, we've got more H+ ions, we have more reactant particles in the same volume, and this means that our particles are more crowded. We're going to increase the frequency of collisions, and that would increase the rate. Please use the exact wording that I am using, because this is the sort of stuff that pops up on mark schemes. And if we plotted a graph of our results, it would be the acid with the steepest gradient that would have the highest rate. And then we have temperature. For temperature, we can use the sodium thiosulfate and hydrochloric acid experiment to the disappearing cross. Now, the sodium thiosulfate is what we'd call the insoluble precipitate. It is forming this cloudy solution, which is making the cross disappear. Now, the theory behind the temperature is that with increased temperature, particles are given more kinetic energy, so they're moving around faster. So this means that we have a higher proportion of particles colliding with a kinetic energy that is above or higher than the activation energy. That means we have increased frequency of collisions, but also particles are colliding more forcefully and with more energy, so they're more likely to be successful, and it's this last one which has more of an effect on rate. And then we have pressure. Pressure is when we decrease the area of our container. So this means that we have the same concentration of particles in a decreased volume. That's therefore going to increase the frequency of collisions and therefore increase the rate. And we've also got surface area. Now, our smallest marble chip will react at the fastest rate, and this is because in a large lump, particles inside that lump are not in contact with reactant particles. They must wait for the particles on the surface to react first. That means that if you have a higher surface area to volume ratio, you've got higher exposure, which increases the frequency of collisions and therefore increases the rate. And it's because of this principle that catalysts are often found as pellets, powders or fine gauzes, which increases their surface area to volume ratio. And then we have catalysts. Now, catalysts speed up the rate of a reaction without being used up or chemically changing the reaction. They create an alternate pathway with a lower activation energy than the original reaction. And that means that a higher proportion of reactant particles have sufficient energy to react. And therefore, we have an increased frequency of successful collisions and therefore increased rate. Catalysts are specific to a reaction, and examples include platinum and palladium. We can use the disappearing cross experiment to investigate the differences in the rates of reactions between different catalysts like copper sulfate. And then we can look at the advantages and disadvantages of catalysts. Now, the advantages. Well, catalysts can save money. They decrease operating time to produce the same amount of a substance. They also allow reactions to take place at lower temperatures, and this can save money on energy bills, but also less fossil fuels need to be combusted, so that can reduce the impact of climate change, but also we can conserve fossil fuels, and also catalysts are never used up. Disadvantages are that catalysts need to be removed and cleaned. They are expensive initially to buy, and they are specific to a reaction. They can also be ruined by impurities which react with the catalyst. And now we're going to look at graphs for a minute. So the rate of a reaction is the gradient. So that's the difference in y divided by the difference in x. So rise over run. However, if our graphs are non-linear, that means they are not a straight line, they might be a curve. You draw a tangent on the outer bend and you calculate the gradient of that tangent. But if they ask you to calculate the value between x and y minutes, you draw a chord, so on the inner bend between the 2 points, and you calculate the gradient of that chord. Identifying conclusions from graphs. An example might be that we find that the gradient is twice for A than it is for B, and that means that if we were doubling our concentration, we're doubling our rates, so we then can say that it's directly proportional. Then to attempt to explain that, we could say that, well, there's 2 times as many H plus ions. That means we've got double the collisions and therefore we've got double the rate. Reversible reactions. If you see a symbol like this in a chemical equation, that is telling you that that equation, that reaction, is reversible. That means that we have 2 reactions happening at the same time at the same rate. Our top arrow, the one on top, is the forward reaction, and the one on the bottom is the backward reaction. Now, energy is conserved. The overall energy change for the forward reaction is equal and opposite to the overall energy change for the backward reaction. That means that if one reaction is endothermic, the other reaction is exothermic. Examples of reversible reactions include cobalt chloride and its reaction with water. Remember, cobalt chloride goes from blue to pink in the presence of water, but it is toxic, so don't get it on your skin. Also, litmus paper. Now, this is when H-lit separates into H plus and and lit plus ions. Remember, it's pink for acidic and blue for alkaline. The reactions that take place inside hand warmers, and also thermal decomposition. Thermal decomposition is simply when a substance breaks down on heating, and a common example is the thermal decomposition of calcium carbonate. Dynamic equilibrium. All reversible reactions in a closed system will eventually reach equilibrium. A closed system is when conditions are controlled, and we can replicate that in a lab by using a bung in a test tube or a conical flask. Now, dynamic equilibrium gets its name because of our reactions are continuously happening, and what it means is that the rate of the forward reaction equals the rate of the backward reaction. So initially, if our forward reaction had the greater rate, our rate of the forward reaction would decrease from its original value, and the backward reaction would increase as products built up. Now, it doesn't chemically change a reaction, so if we imagine it as counters, if we have more counters on our reactant side than our product side, that will not change even though the counters are moving at the same rate. And examples of dynamic equilibrium include NO2 going to N2O4, but NO2 is toxic. Our last mini topic is Le Chatelier's principle. Now, Henri Le Chatelier proposed that if equilibrium was disturbed, equilibrium would shift to favour either the forward or the backward reaction to counteract the external change. For example, if we increase the pressure of a reaction, equilibrium would shift to favour the side which produces the less or the least gas moles. So we look at the state symbol to determine that. If the gas moles on either side of the equation were equal, then there would be no effect. If we increase the concentration of either the reactants or the products, equilibrium would shift to remove those reactants or products. So if we increase the concentration of the products, for example, equilibrium would shift to the left. It would favour the backward reaction to turn these products back into reactants. And if we increase the temperature, equilibrium would shift to favour the endothermic reaction. So if an exam question told us that the forward reaction was the exothermic reaction, we could deduce that the endothermic reaction is the opposite, it's the backward reaction. So if we increase the temperature, equilibrium would shift to the left to favour the backward reaction. And finally, catalysts. Catalysts do not have an effect on dynamic equilibrium, and this is because they increase the rates for both the forward and the backward reaction by the same amount. And that's all for this video, so well done if you made it to the end, and see you next time.